July 25th, 1944. The Norman countryside lay still beneath a pale morning sky. Wheat fields, long neglected by the farmers who had fled or buried themselves in their cellars, stood motionless in the summer air. The hedgerows, those ancient walls of earth and root that the French call bocage, cast long shadows across lanes so narrow that two men could not walk side by side without brushing shoulders. Somewhere beneath those hedgerows, German soldiers had been waiting for 7 weeks, and they had eaten cold rations by night, buried their wounded by morning, and listened for the sound that always came, the low, rolling thunder of Allied artillery. They had stopped the Americans before. They had stopped the British. They had turned Normandy into a killing ground that devoured youth from every nation that dared advance across its fields. On this particular morning, the German defenders of the Panzer Lehr Division had done what experienced soldiers always do when the night grows quiet. They had told themselves that today would be like yesterday, that the lines would hold, that they knew how war was fought, and that they were very good at it. They were wrong. They had no vocabulary for what was about to happen. At approximately 9:38 in the morning, the droning began. It came first as a vibration in the chest, say that low frequency that registers not in the ears but in the sternum. Then it became sound, a layered, overlapping, oceanic roar that seemed to compress the air itself. At approximately 11 o'clock that morning, 1,500 American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators arrived over the German lines west of St. Lo, and the sky ceased to be sky. It became machinery. It became the audible expression of an economy that the Wehrmacht's own high command had been warned about for years and had refused to believe. In less than 2 hours, more than 3,300 tons of bombs fell on a corridor of Norman earth, roughly 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep. The ground shook for 12 miles in every direction. Farm animals died standing. Church steeples folded. The hedgerows that German engineers had spent weeks transforming into fortifications became craters in the time it took a match to burn down to a man's fingers. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, a decorated veteran of Rommel's Africa Corps, a man who had fought across 3 continents, later described what he saw from his position with words that remained in the historical record for the rest of the century. The bomb carpets rolled toward us, most of them passing only a few yards away, a pall of dust with fountains of earth spewing high in the air. In that pall of dust, and approximately 1,000 German soldiers died in less time than it takes to eat a meal. Every command post in the sector was demolished. Tank communications were severed. Panzer grenadiers who had held their positions for 48 days were found wandering in the smoke, their weapons discarded, their orders gone, their understanding of what war meant shaken loose from every foundation they had built it upon. This is the story of what came after that dust settled. And it is not simply the story of a battle. It is the story of a collision between 2 fundamentally different ideas about what a modern nation can produce, what a free democracy can marshal in defense of its principles, and how that collision was experienced, viscerally, personally, catastrophically, by the men who had been trained to believe their military tradition was the finest in the world. To understand the horror that German veterans carried with them out of France in the summer of 1944, one must first understand what they had been taught to believe, and why those beliefs were not unreasonable. The German Wehrmacht that occupied France in 1940 had accomplished something historians still struggle to fully comprehend. In 46 days, it had broken an army that many considered among the best trained and best equipped in Europe. The French military had more tanks than the Germans at the time of the invasion. It had formidable artillery, experienced officers, and defensive positions of significant depth. None of it mattered. The speed, the coordination, the relentless forward pressure of the German blitzkrieg, lightning war, had fractured French command structures before the generals could respond, had poured armored columns through gaps before reserves could fill them, and had collapsed the psychological will to resist before the physical ability to resist was truly exhausted. Germany had, in 1940, demonstrated what speed could do to an army that thought in terms of static lines. And the Wehrmacht never forgot that lesson. But in the summer of 1944, crouched in the ruins of their Norman positions, the veterans of that older, triumphant Wehrmacht were about to be given that lesson in return, at a scale that their finest theorists had never anticipated. To understand the scale of what the Americans built and deployed, one must step back from the battlefield entirely and look at the map from an altitude of perhaps 50,000 feet, not the altitude of a combat aircraft, but the altitude of economic history. The United States entered the war in December 1941 with an army that had fewer than 200,000 men and an industrial base still in the process of transitioning from peacetime production. By 1944, American factories were producing more military equipment in a single month than many nations produced in a year. The GMCCCKW, the 2.5-ton cargo truck that soldiers called the Jimmy, or the Deuce and a Half, was manufactured in the United States at a rate and volume that the German logistics staff could not have modeled if they had tried. By the end of the war, the United States Army had acquired more than 812,000 of these vehicles. So with over 560,000 of the GMC model alone rolling off assembly lines between 1941 and 1945. Germany, by contrast, was a nation where the horse still pulled the majority of Wehrmacht supply wagons, not because German engineers lacked the knowledge to build trucks, but because the German economy, stretched across 3 fronts and 7 years of war preparation, could not produce them in sufficient numbers. Yet the Wehrmacht that invaded France in 1940 was motorized at the tip and horse-drawn at the tail. The American army that broke out of Normandy in 1944 was motorized from the supply ship to the foxhole, but in the summer of 1944, none of this context mattered to the man behind a German machine gun in the hedgerows west of Saint-Lô. What mattered was that the bombs had stopped falling, and in the silence that followed, something far more terrifying than bombs had begun. At the infantry came first, American soldiers emerging from the smoke with rifles and bayonets, and the particular determination of men who had watched their comrades die for 7 weeks and believed, finally, that the end of this hedge-bordered nightmare was within reach. Then, behind the infantry, came the armor. The Sherman tanks of the U.S. 7th Corps broke through what remained of the Panzerlehr's defensive crust on the afternoon of July 25, 1944. General Bayerlein, assessing his losses, stated that out of his division's approximately 5,000 combat troops, the bombing and subsequent ground assault had rendered his unit, in his own recorded words, finished. By nightfall of July 27th, the 30th Infantry Division, which had suffered the terrible misfortune of American bombs falling short and killing 111 of its own men, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, reported back through its communications net with a sentence that carried within it the weight of the entire preceding 49 days of stalemate. This thing has busted wide open. And then, on August 1st, 1944, at exactly noon, the United States Third Army was committed to the fight. It came to life under the command of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a figure who understood war as motion, who regarded the static defense of ground as both a military and philosophical failure, and who had been waiting, through a period of calculated disgrace and enforced silence, for precisely this moment. The Third Army did not ease into the fight. It erupted. More than 100,000 combat troops had already poured south through a gap barely 5 miles wide near the town of Avranches, seizing bridges, bypassing resistance, and advancing at speeds that bewildered German observers who had just weeks earlier been reporting to Berlin that the Allies were bogged down irretrievably in the bocage. What happened next was, by any honest standard, one of the most staggering exhibitions of military momentum in the entire history of modern warfare. The armored divisions of the Third Army, the Fourth Armored, which the Germans had already christened Roosevelt's Butchers, the Sixth Armored, at the Second French Armored, fanned out across the open French countryside beyond the hedgerows with a freedom of movement that seemed almost hallucinatory to the men experiencing it. The bocage, that strangling terrain of perpetual ambush and claustrophobic combat, was suddenly behind them. Ahead lay rolling plains, open roads, and an enemy that had not yet recovered from the shock of Operation Cobra. On some days in early August 1944, American armored columns advanced more than 60 miles. On August 25th, the 4th Armored Division drove on the city of Troyes, 85 miles southeast of Paris, in a single operational bound. By mid-August, Patton was able to claim, with documented accuracy, that as of August 14th, the Third Army had advanced further and faster than any army in history. 1 month after its activation at noon on August 1st, the Third Army had swept 400 miles across central France, and from the Normandy fields it had entered to the Lorraine region at the gates of Germany itself. To the German soldiers who experienced this advance from the wrong side of it, the velocity was not simply a military shock. It was an ideological confrontation with something they had no framework to process. The Wehrmacht had been built, trained, and sustained by a doctrine that prized tactical perfection, the carefully controlled maneuver, the disciplined use of combined arms, the defense in depth. The German soldiers were among the most technically proficient warriors of the 20th century. Their small unit commanders were given extraordinary initiative under the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, mission command, which trusted the man on the ground to find a solution within the commander's intent without waiting for explicit orders. They were resilient, adaptive, and ferocious in defense. Even in retreat, as Colonel Robert Allen, Patton's assistant intelligence officer, is documented with genuine professional respect. The enemy's continued tactical control, despite the tremendous difficulties under which he operated, was a remarkable military feat. In the face of shattered communications, tremendous losses, constant retreating, and practically no air support, the enemy still maintained overall control of his tactical situation. He constantly fell back, but there was no mass collapse. At every critical point, as he stubbornly defended and delayed, and yet all of that skill, all of that tactical excellence, all of those brilliantly executed defensive maneuvers could not stop what was coming, because what was coming was not merely an army. It was a logistics system. It was a manufacturing economy. It was the mobilized productivity of a nation of 130 million people who had grown up with transcontinental railroads, nationwide trucking networks, and the most extensive road system in the world. Germany's generals had built the finest tactical machine in Europe. America had built the finest logistical machine in human history, and in the summer of 1944, those two machines met on the roads of France. Consider what it took to keep the Third Army moving at the speed Patton demanded. A single American armored division consumed approximately 150,000 gallons of fuel on a day of active advance. Yet the combined First and Third Armies together consumed 800,000 gallons of gasoline every single day of their pursuit across France. The supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the invasion beaches at Normandy, where cargo ships were unloading material at a rate the Wehrmacht's logistics staff, had they known the numbers, would have found literally incredible. In response to the crisis of supplying an army that was moving faster than its own supply chain could follow, its American planners assembled a solution in less than a month that was, like the advance it was feeding, unlike anything the world had seen before. They called it the Red Ball Express. Launched on August 25, 1944, the same day the 4th Armored Division advanced on Troyes, the Red Ball Express assembled 23,000 truck drivers and mechanics, 3/4 of them Black American soldiers who had been barred by the segregated U.S. Army from serving in most combat roles SN gave them 6,000 vehicles and a dedicated one-way highway running from St. Lo east toward the supply depots of the advancing front. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated 5,958 vehicles in continuous motion around the clock, hauling more than 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Between its launch and the day it ceased operations in November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered more than 412,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, clothing, and equipment, medical supplies, Bailey Bridge sections, spare tank tracks, artillery shells, motor oil, and yes, the ubiquitous small boxes that German prisoners would later describe with expressions that moved between disbelief and something approaching grief. The K rations. Those individually packaged American military meals, each containing canned meat, biscuits, malted milk tablets, a sugar cube, hard candies, and, tucked in every box without exception, a small chocolate bar and a package of cigarettes. And in a Wehrmacht where an ordinary soldier received 6 cigarettes per day as his tobacco ration, the discovery that American infantrymen were issued cigarettes and chocolate as a standard component of every field meal became, for many German soldiers and prisoners, the single most eloquent summary of everything they were fighting against. It was not the Sherman tank that broke the German soldiers' confidence. It was the chocolate bar in the pocket of the man who drove the Sherman. And it was the casual industrial abundance of a democracy at war. Abundance so normalized that it came in individual cardboard boxes, 1 per man, 3 times a day. It is worth pausing here to understand the inner life of the German soldier who encountered this reality for the first time, because the historical record preserves that encounter in enough detail to make it vivid. The German military philosophy of the Second World War was built on the idea that character, discipline, and tactical sophistication could overcome material disadvantage. This was not an unreasonable belief in 1940, when the Blitzkrieg proved it with spectacular force. It had become, by 1944, a sustaining mythology that the German command structure desperately required in order to function at all. German officers knew the production numbers. The intelligence branches of the Wehrmacht had been receiving accurate assessments of American industrial output since at least 1943. Those reports had been filed, discussed, and in many cases suppressed by a command culture that could not psychologically afford to believe them. Alfred Jodl, the German chief of staff, admitted in captivity after the war that the war was already lost in the West at the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the war of movement in France. Not lost militarily in the sense of tactical failure, lost economically, lost industrially, lost in the space between what Germany could produce and what America was already producing. The men in the German trenches of Normandy were fighting a war whose outcome had effectively been determined in the factories of Michigan and Ohio years before the first Sherman crossed the Norman soil. What the German veterans who survived the French campaign carried home with them, those who were permitted to go home, and those who were not instead sealed in the closing ring of the Falaise pocket, was the memory of a specific, sustained, visceral horror. Not the horror of death, which they had known since Stalingrad and El Alamein and the mud of the Eastern Front. It was a different horror, the horror of the road, the horror of running, the horror of watching, from the wrong side of a ditch, at an apparently endless column of American vehicles moving east at a pace that made German doctrinal concepts feel suddenly ancient. They had grown up learning about the Blitzkrieg. They had practiced it themselves. They knew what mobile warfare looked like. But they had never seen it sustained at this scale, at this speed, over this distance, by an army that never seemed to run short of what it needed because it carried behind it. And in a convoy of nearly 6,000 trucks rolling around the clock on dedicated highways, a rolling warehouse the size of a small city. The Falaise pocket became, in the last days of August 1944, the monument to what the American advance had achieved and what the German army had lost. Between August 12th and August 22nd, the Allied forces, American, British, Canadian, and Polish, closed a ring around the retreating remnants of two German armies. While the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army had effectively ceased to exist as organized fighting formations. 25 out of 38 German divisions were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. For the entire Normandy campaign, German losses stood at approximately 240,000 killed or wounded, 200,000 missing or captured, and 1,500 tanks destroyed or abandoned. The roads leading east from Falaise, documented by the Allied officers and correspondents who walked through them in the days that followed, looked like the end of something. Dead horses, overturned artillery pieces, German staff cars riddled with strafing runs, their doors swinging open onto paperwork that no longer mattered. Officers' luggage, field kitchens, personal letters, the abandoned evidence of an army that had believed, until the final weeks of its existence, that France was a position it could hold. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, visited the Falaise Road and was visibly shaken. He described it later as one of the greatest killing grounds of the war. Even Patton, not a man given to the sentimentality of battlefields, grew quiet when he passed through. But the Falaise pocket was also a numerical record of what had escaped, and those who escaped carried with them something more dangerous to the German war effort than any weapon. Yet they carried the memory of what the American advance had felt like from underneath it. Approximately 20,000 to 50,000 German soldiers broke through the closing Allied ring before it sealed, and those men retreated east through France with the knowledge, not theoretical, not abstract, but physical, experiential, stamped into their nervous systems by 40 days of running, that the American army behind them did not tire because the trucks that fed it did not stop. Yet the Red Ball convoys rolled through the night on roads lit only by blackout lights and the flickering of exhausted headlamps. The drivers went 48 hours without sleep, switching at the wheel while the vehicle was still moving so that the gas pedal was never released. They carried gasoline and ammunition and rations and bridge sections and the 10,000 items of expendable modern war. And behind them, on the beaches of Normandy that had been bathed in blood 10 weeks earlier, more supply ships were arriving with more of everything: more chocolate bars, more cigarettes, more fuel, more trucks to carry the fuel, more parts to fix the trucks. Here is what a German officer who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front wrote in a letter recovered from his effects after his capture near Nancy in September 1944. A letter that was translated by U.S. Army intelligence and preserved in the operational records. It describes, without sentimentality and without the language of defeat, what the American advance had looked like from the perspective of a man trained in the finest military tradition in Europe. They do not move as we move. They do not run short as we run short. Every time we stop them, they absorb the delay and come forward again, not with fresh men from somewhere close behind the line, but with fresh material from somewhere so far behind it that we cannot reach it. And I do not know how to fight this. He was not wrong. He could not fight it. Not because the German soldier was inadequate as a soldier. General Heinz Guderian himself, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, said of Patton's campaign that, from the standpoint of a tank specialist, yet I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place. But because the material foundation beneath the American advance was something outside the parameters of any doctrine the Wehrmacht had developed, German military theory, at its highest levels, had mastered the science of doing more with less. American military theory, almost without intending to, had mastered something else entirely: the science of doing more with more. By the 1st of September 1944, Patton's Third Army had outrun even the Red Ball Express. The armored columns had moved so far so fast that even the new all-weather dedicated convoy system could not keep pace with them. On August 31st, the Third Army effectively stalled near the Moselle River, not because the Germans had stopped it. No German force on the Western Front was capable of stopping it, but because it had consumed the last of its fuel. His Patton requested 400,000 gallons of gasoline to resume the advance. He received 32,000. The army that had covered 400 miles in 1 month sat immobilized on the banks of the Moselle because the trucks that fed it had reached the limit of their range. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, watching the supply crisis unfold from his position near the front lines, described it as a tactician's hell and a quartermaster's purgatory. For the Germans, yet this involuntary pause was a reprieve they had no right to expect and every reason to exploit. General Hermann Balck and the reconstituted German forces in Lorraine spent the weeks of September fortifying the Moselle line and preparing for the assault they knew would eventually come. They were good at it. They had, in a sense, been preparing for this moment their entire professional lives. But the pause was temporary because the condition that had caused it, American abundance, American logistics, the relentless forward pressure of the American industrial machine, was not temporary. It was structural. It was permanent. It was baked into the nature of what America was. Time magazine, in September 1944, published a sentence in a story about the Red Ball Express that deserves to be read slowly because it contains, in the compressed language of journalism, an entire historical argument. This miracle was in the American tradition, and a tradition the Germans have never really understood. It was begotten of a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking chains, to endless roads and millions of automobiles. The Germans had built the Autobahn. They had studied American industrial methods. Their engineers had toured Ford plants in the 1930s. Their economists had read the production reports. And yet, as Time's observation suggests, what the Red Ball Express represented could not be understood purely in technical or economic terms. It was cultural. It was the product of a society that had been organized around movement and abundance for a century before the war began. A society in which the road was not a military asset, but a civilian reality. In which the truck was not a strategic weapon, but a delivery mechanism. And in which mass production was not a wartime expedient, but the foundational vocabulary of ordinary commercial life. When that society mobilized for war, it did not have to learn how to mass produce and mass distribute. It simply turned what it already knew how to do toward a different purpose. And in the autumn of 1944, as the Third Army refueled and resumed its advance toward the German border, to German prisoners being moved rearward through the supply lines that stretched back toward the Norman beaches, encountered the product of that mobilization in its most ordinary form. They were fed, not poorly fed, not grudgingly fed, but generously, matter-of-factly fed in the manner of a system that had been designed around surplus rather than scarcity. The K-ration chocolate bar, that small, dark, yet precisely manufactured square of sweetened chocolate that came packed in every individual meal kit issued to every American soldier on every day of the campaign, became, for many of these prisoners, the most unnerving artifact of their captivity. It was not the abundance itself that was disorienting. Men who had been half-starved in the Falaise pocket understood hunger. The food itself was welcome. What was disorienting was the casualness of it. And the American soldier who handed over a K-ration box did not regard it as a gift or a luxury or a morale investment. He regarded it as standard equipment. He had several more in his pack. There would be more tomorrow, shipped from a depot in Chartres, trucked up from the beaches in a convoy that had never stopped running since August. The chocolate bar was not the point. The chocolate bar was the symbol. Yet what it symbolized was a system so deeply committed to the welfare of its individual participants, so structurally organized around the idea that each soldier, regardless of rank, deserved a full meal 3 times a day, that even in the middle of the fastest armored advance in the history of modern warfare, someone, somewhere, had made sure the chocolate was there. German veterans spoke of this for decades after the war ended, not always with bitterness, or sometimes with a quality closer to wonder. They had been formed by a military culture that prized sacrifice, endurance, and the subordination of individual comfort to collective purpose. They had been told, in 1,000 ways both explicit and implicit, that the willingness to suffer for the cause was itself a form of strength. And then they had fought against an army in which individual comfort was not a luxury to be earned through suffering, but a baseline condition maintained by an industrial civilization at full production, and they had lost. Not because they suffered less, but because the other side had found a way to fight without requiring suffering as its organizing principle. That discovery, that a democracy, set with its chaotic freedoms and its commercial abundance and its insistence on the dignity of the individual soldier, could produce a war machine more powerful than anything the authoritarian state had forged in the furnace of its ideology, was not simply a military shock. It was a civilizational one. General Günther Blumentritt, the German chief of staff who would live long enough to assess Patton's campaign from the distance of the post-war years, captured the professional reaction of the German officer corps in language that avoided neither admiration nor its implications. We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet: activity, vitesse, vitesse. Activity, speed, speed. It was, in one phrase, the entire summary of what the 400-mile advance had meant from the German perspective. Not the brilliance of a single commander, though Patton's brilliance was genuine. Not the courage of individual American soldiers, though that courage was amply documented. But the speed that could not be separated from the fuel that sustained it, and the fuel that could not be separated from the trucks that carried it, and the trucks that could not be separated from the factories that built them, and the factories that could not be separated from the civilization that had made mass production its most ordinary accomplishment. What the German veterans of the 1944 French campaign were witnessing, from the wrong end of it, at 60 miles per day, with the sound of Sherman engines growing louder behind them, was not merely a military defeat. It was an argument, made in steel and gasoline and chocolate bars, about what kind of nation wins a modern industrial war. Yet it was an argument that the Wehrmacht's most perceptive officers had recognized as early as 1943, had documented in intelligence reports that were quietly filed away and had been powerless to prevent. In captivity, Alfred Jodl, who had once sat at Hitler's side in the map room at Wolfschanz and made the decisions that sent armies across 3 continents, acknowledged what the French roads had already answered. The war in the West had been decided not at Falaise, not at the Moselle, and not in any single engagement, but in the moment that the industrial output of American democracy exceeded the capacity of any doctrine or any army to absorb. That moment had come before the first Sherman rolled off a landing craft onto a Norman beach. The campaign was, in the most profound sense, a demonstration of a conclusion that had already been reached. In the years after the war, the roads of France were rebuilt, the craters were filled. Yes, the hedgerows grew back over the places where young men from Ohio and North Carolina and Bavaria and Brandenburg had fought with a ferocity that no historical narrative can fully recapture. The French rebuilt their villages. The farmers returned to their fields. The supply depots were dismantled. The red ball route markers were taken down, and the highways that had carried 412,000 tons of democracy's material abundance toward the German border were returned to their peacetime purpose, and nothing visible remained of the speed. Nothing visible remained of the tide. But the men who had run before it, those German veterans who had stood in the dust of the Norman fields on the morning of July 25th and felt the ground shake and looked up and seen the sky turn to machinery, those men carried what they had seen with them for the rest of their lives. They carried it in the way a man carries an encounter with something he cannot fully explain. They had been trained in the doctrine of the superior will. They had been told that character, discipline, and the purity of the soldier's purpose were sufficient against any material advantage. They had fought with skill and courage and professional pride until the summer of 1944, and then they had run 60 miles in a day, and 60 miles again the next day, and 60 miles the day after that, with the sound of Sherman engines behind them and the knowledge growing with every mile, clearer with every abandoned artillery piece left by the roadside because there was no fuel to move it, that what was chasing them was not simply an army. It was the full productive capacity of a free people. It was factories and roads and 2.5 million trucks and the ordinary, industrial, a democratic abundance of a nation that had decided the war was worth winning and had organized every aspect of its economy toward that end without ever quite sacrificing the chocolate bar in the individual soldier's field ration. There is a particular quality to the horror that comes not from cruelty or violence, but from the encounter with an overwhelming abundance you cannot match, an inextinguishable supply of what you are running short of. A civilization that produces its weapons the way it produces its groceries, relentlessly, efficiently, in quantities that make your own production seem artisanal by comparison. That was the horror the German veterans of the French campaign carried home, not the horror of the bombers over Saint-Lô, though that had been profound, not the horror of the Falaise roads, though those roads had been genuinely apocalyptic. The deepest horror was quieter than either of those. It was the sound of another convoy leaving the beach. It was the understanding, arrived at somewhere between Avranches and the Moselle, that there would always be another convoy, that the supply of what the Americans needed to keep moving would never be exhausted because the system that produced it had not been built for this war specifically. It had been built for a civilization. And it had been built by a people who believed that individuals mattered enough to be fed 3 times a day in the field, who organized their national life around movement and connection and the provision of goods across continental distances, and who, when the moment came to turn that civilization toward war, discovered that what they had built in peacetime was sufficient, with minor adjustments, to defeat anything in the world. And in the cardboard pocket of every K-ration box, as through 400 miles of liberated French countryside, there was the chocolate bar, small, dark, precisely manufactured, unremarkable to the man who ate it. The most eloquent argument ever made, not in the language of ideology or philosophy or political theory, but in the language of material fact, for what it means when a free nation brings everything it has to the defense of what it believes. The hedgerows have been quiet for 80 years now. The roads of France bear other traffic, other names, and other lives. But somewhere in the historical record, in the depositions of captured generals, in the intelligence reports of men who watched the convoys pass, in the private letters recovered from the pockets of the defeated, the shock of that summer persists, not as a story about tactics or commanders or the cleverness of military planning, as a story about what happens when a people who have always believed in abundance is always organized their lives around the assumption that there is enough of everything for everyone, finally pick up a weapon and refuse to put it down. The German veterans of that campaign understood something, in the end, that their high command had never permitted itself to understand, that they had not been defeated by a general. They had been defeated by a country, by all of it, every factory and every road and every truck and every chocolate bar, by the full, free, relentless, generous, as terrifying abundance of America at war.